Estamos en el panel de gobernadores del Cono Sur, o ex-gobernadores. La sesión va a ser en inglés porque son las reglas de la LACEA. Hay muchos académicos que vienen de otros países no latinoamericanos y por lo tanto vamos a movernos al inglés. Disculpen los que, bueno, por esto, pero son las reglas de la conferencia. So we have today the privilege to have here 3 governors or former governors in this panel. So first of all, I'd like to thank you for making a slot in your agendas to talk about monetary policy in the region and also in general.
And future for former governors.
Well, I'm going to tell you. I will explain your trajectory now. Okay. So, in order of seniority, I want to present you Mario Vergara, who is the current governor of the Central Bank of Uruguay for the second time since 2015. He had been before from 2008 to 2013, and in the middle he was finance minister of Uruguay. Second, Rodrigo Vergara, with V. Yeah?
No confunden.
Former governor of the Central Bank of Chile and now at the Centro Estudios Públicos allí en Santiago. He was governor of the Central Bank of Chile between 2011 and 2016, so just 11 months ago today. And finally, Federico Sturzenegger, current governor of the Central Bank of Argentina for almost 1 year.
2 years.
Almost 2 years, yeah, sorry. All of them have a strong academic background with PhDs in the US. I have heard them many times in Basel, in the region, so I can anticipate that we will have a very interesting and even juicy panel. So I have prepared 5 questions. So the format of the panel will be an answering of this question by turn, so that can be made a bit more agile. And these questions are about inflation, monetary policy, objective of monetary policy, etc. So let's start with the first question, and I would like to ask Mario to start the turn, and then Rodrigo, and then Federico on this question. And it's a general point I'd like to hear from a region in which inflation is not so much controlled. What is your view on the lack of inflationary pressures in advanced economies, and how this change is affecting the region, in particular if this is helping also to mitigate inflationary pressures in your country?
Great. Well, first of all, it's a privilege being here. Thank you very much to the BIS for the invitation. I can imagine that is an interesting experience for Federico, which is surrounded by Vergaras. It doesn't happen every day. Well, actually, inflation is declining in most of our countries. I think partly because our policy merits, so why not try to take some credit for that, but also because a more broader process in the region and in the international economy as a whole. But when we analyze how what's happening on a global basis, how that impact on our countries and particularly in inflation in our countries, we have to take into account that in general we have 2 currencies. So for inflation is not only important what's happening with the process of our own currency in terms of supply and demand, but also of course all the factors that affect supply and demand in the real sector, which in turn affects inflation, but also what's happening particularly in our cases, what's happening with the US dollar, the perspective, the expectations of the strength or weakness of the US dollar, because it affects a lot in terms of capital flows and in terms of portfolio changes that in small countries, for example, in Europe, we have a very, very small exchange rate market. So changing portfolios of institutional investors have a huge impact. So it's not just what matters is not just the economy of flows, but also the economy of stocks. No? So inflation is also affected by the financial side, and in particular on how we deal with exchange rates. And something that in general we all have learned after being champions of crisis, like in Latin America, no? We have dozens of crises in the last 50 or 60 years, is that exchange rate flexibility is crucial to deal better with inflation and monetary policy. So one of the lessons that I think most of us have learned in this process is that we had to learn how to implement monetary policy in a context of exchange rate flexibility. Of course, it affects current inflation in terms of the process of having a US dollar weakening during several years, since the crisis in 2008 until 2013. Then after the Bernanke tantrum and the expectation of on a strengthening US dollar in the world, we had a pressure for depreciation of our currencies. But in the last 6 or 7 months, we returned to a context in which the expectations of the US dollars are again, at least to stabilize or even weakening a little bit. That's why we have these capital flows that was coming significantly to emerging markets until 2013. We have the reversion of that process for a couple of years, from 13 to 15. And now we are again having capital inflows that, of course, are challenges for the macro stability and the stability of prices in small open economies like ours. So again, monetary policy is a lot dependent on how we deal with the exchange rates, and of course, we also have other factors that affect that. That is the climate issues have affected inflation in Uruguay, at least in the last 3, 4, or 5 years. We have a couple of droughts that affected the prices of some basic items of consumption. But this year, together with having a declining expectation of the US dollar in our country, we also have a very good weather in terms of the impact of climate on prices. So we are having inflation within the target range of the central bank after a few years in which inflation was above the target. But the challenge is to keep inflation in the range because we are handling monetary policy and fiscal policy and so on in a context of a very large political uncertainty on a global basis, but mainly also financial uncertainty. I think that in the context, the global economy is somehow improving, but it's not strong, but the figures in stock exchanges are absolute records. So I'm quite concerned about that, and particularly how it will affect our economies when this, I'm not sure if there's a huge bubble yet, but we are in the process of having that. When asset prices will adjust, how it will affect our economies through the exchange rate channel, and also how it will affect our prices in our economies.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the BIS for inviting me to this panel. I'm the only former governor in this panel, but you will, for sure, at some point be former governor. So, and that's good. I mean, it's not bad. I mean, there's life after the central bank. So, I mean, this is a difficult question. Why prices are so low in advanced economies? Actually, people from the Federal Reserve, if I'm not wrong, Chair Yellen herself have said that they do not fully understand why inflation is so low in the US and in advanced economies in more general terms. There are some hypotheses. One of them is technology, which basically lower the cost of consumer good prices. And it's also related to information, which makes make it difficult to raise prices, in the sense that consumers have more ability to compare prices. Other hypothesis is low wage growth, but that's basically a definition. I mean, inflation is low because wage inflation is also low. And now, why wage inflation is low in an environment where unemployment is very, very low? There are also some hypotheses there. Automation, perhaps, which puts, some people say, a cap on wage growth. Globalization is a third hypothesis, and China is the name of the game there. China today is 15% of world trade. 25 years ago, it was less than 1%. And with low costs and prices coming from China, that also affects world inflation. Demographics, some people have mentioned this as a possible explanation, in the sense that it has increased savings and lower aggregate demand. The leveraging, in the sense that people and companies are less, or let's say more afraid of debt, so they reduce consumption. And these are all hypotheses, probably all of them valid at some point, but in my view, as the labor market has tightened, as commodity prices are increasing, and as growth has gone up, I believe that at some point inflation will also go up in advanced economies. The other part of the question was whether this has affected the region. I'm not sure whether this has affected the region. Actually, inflation is low in many countries, but not that low. I mean, it's low now in Chile. It's slightly below the target range. It's low in Brazil, but it's still, well, actually, Venezuela is an exception, of course, the outlier. But it's relatively high in Argentina, in this country, in Mexico, in Colombia. So I'm not sure whether this has affected the region in a major way. In my country, in Chile, inflation is slightly below the target. It has to do a lot with some of the elements that Mario was mentioning before. There's been an appreciation of the exchange rate. But inflation is 1.9% at this point, and the target range is between 2 and 4%. It is expected to go soon to the target range. So that's basically.
Okay, good morning everybody, and first of all my apologies. It feels a bit uncomfortable to speak in English in Buenos Aires. I have to tell you the truth. So, but anyway, if that's the rules, we'll go with the rules. But my apologies for that. On this question about low inflation in developed economies, let me look at it at a different spin, which is not to discuss why inflation is low, which I think Rodrigo has covered very well, but on some of the consequences of that low inflation. And one important consequence of that low inflation is the low interest rates. And I think that definitely has an impact on our economies, and I want to elaborate a little bit on that. The reduction in interest rates in the developed world is a little bit of a secular movement. It's not something that has happened in the recent years. It's been basically happening since the mid-1980s. I think there are some very fundamental structural reasons why interest rates will fall and will continue to... It's okay, please. It's very bothersome. The reasons for the reduction in the interest rate is, on the one hand, a world that has become richer over the last 20 or 30 years, that has increased savings. So the total supply of savings in the world has been growing. There are demographic reasons for the increase in the savings rate. For example, the fact that the Chinese families have lesser amount of kids have increased the ability of Chinese families to save. So at the global level, you have a world where there's more savings. And at the same time, you have less of a demand for capital. There's a very nice paper by Janice Eberly last week from Northwestern University, and she basically finds that a lot of the growth in developed countries are happening in the digital economy, and the digital economy uses very little physical capital. It uses much more human capital. So a lot of the growth is happening in industries that use little capital at the time that you have a world which is providing and producing more savings. So there's more of an offer of capital. And I think the combination of those things have basically led to a a reduction, a secular reduction, a structural reduction in interest rates. Okay, so this perhaps is the first point. And the most important thing for the case of Argentina specifically, which is a country which is emerging, or this government started with a very large, or was inherited a large fiscal deficit, which has to gradually achieve fiscal convergence, and it has to decide, how am I going to finance this deficit during this transition? And you basically have two ways of financing that deficit during transition. You can either finance it with debt, or you can finance it with inflation tax. And what this government has said is to reduce the usage of the inflation tax, which the previous government was using more intensively, and that means that you're going to finance part of the transition with debt. And this is where you have basically a link between the two things, because the fact that you do that at a moment that the interest rates are very low, in a country that, on the other hand, inherited a very low debt to GDP ratio, basically eases the transition or the disinflation process during this convergence to a macroeconomy which has lower inflation and more sustainable fiscal accounts. So I think this has had, in the specific case of Argentina, has provided better international conditions for a gradual transition to a new scheme.
Okay, so we can move, going a bit more inwards. Mario mentioned a bit about the current inflation situation, also Rodrigo, but I'd like you to make a more a structural assessment of the performance of the regime in your respective countries, and which are the challenges ahead, if there is any. Maybe there are not. Maybe Rodrigo, you can start.
Yes, thanks. We have a fully fledged inflation targeting regime, a flexible inflation targeting regime, and it's been in place for about 20 years now. I think it's worked well. I mean, and the basic numbers that are in place show that. The average inflation target is 3% in the case of Chile, with a target range of plus minus 1 point, so between 2 and 4%. And the average inflation rate since this scheme is in place has been 3.2%. So basically, we've achieved our targets. A bit of history. We did have a high inflation rate back in the early 1990s when the central bank became independent. And then we had declining inflation targets until the year 2000, but it was not a fully fledged inflation targeting scheme in the sense that we also had a target for the exchange rate. Since 2000, we have an inflation targeting, and since then the target has been 3%. Some of the useful elements of this scheme is first transparency, which helps to gain credibility. As you know, in these schemes, expectations are quite important. And the whole inflation targeting, I think it's worked well, and it's helped to bring credibility to the inflation targeting. There was a big investment at the beginning of this, in the sense that monetary policy was was a significant tightening of monetary policy at the beginning of the 1980s, which helped to gain credibility. That meant an increase in unemployment, a significant deceleration, but that was the price to pay at the beginning to gain this credibility. There have been many challenges during all this period. We did have inflations above target in 2007 and 2008, significantly above target, about 7% those years. And of course, some credibility was lost during that time, but very soon inflation went down, and actually in 2009 inflation was negative. Of course, that time helped the global financial crisis, only in this sense, of course. Then, for instance, we had episodes of depreciation between 2013 and 15. Mari was speaking about that earlier. So it was kind of difficult to explain the population that inflation was above target because these transitory shocks. The problem was that the transitory shocks remained in place for quite a while, because we had a shock in 2013, a shock in 2014, and a shock in 2015. So inflation was above target for a couple of years. The basic policy response was stay calm. Actually, we cut rates during that period because the economy was decelerating. But it was quite a challenge to explain to the population that this was a transitory shock and the inflation would go down soon, and finally did go down and went to target, and now it's actually below target. Now, one final point on this. Fiscal policy has never been part of the equation here, in the sense that there's no fiscal dominance of any kind. The central bank, in the case of Chile, cannot finance the government, not directly or indirectly. And actually that's in the Constitution. We cannot, for instance, we cannot, not only we cannot buy government bonds in primary auctions, we cannot buy them in the secondary market. So that's been, I think, quite important in this credibility that I was mentioning before.
Okay, no, we don't have 20 years, but we have 20 months. So that's, you start from the beginning. Basically, our discussion happened in 2015 when we were putting together and thinking about the macroeconomic framework in case the Macri would win the elections. And basically what we had was the history of Argentina. The history of Argentina was a history where this inflation had always been anchored in fixing the exchange rate. We know the literature very well. There's a very ample literature on money-based versus exchange rate-based stabilizations. You know, when you do an exchange rate-based stabilization, you typically have an initial boom. Interest rates come down very quickly. So it's kind of very, in the short term, it's very successful. We knew that, of course. But in the medium to long term, you put the economy in a framework where the economy had no ability to adjust to external shocks. And these shocks eventually come and the economy needs the adjustment. So over and over again, the experiences with fixing exchange rates and exchange rate-based stabilizations were successful at the beginning, but were very costly for the country in the medium long term, because the only way that you could somehow provide again for yourself that flexibility was through a macroeconomic crisis. So we said we're going to go the harder way. It's not a new road. I mean, it's what the Chileans did, what the Uruguayans did, what the Peruvians did, what the Brazilians did, what the people in New Zealand, Australia. So it's a path well trodden and well known, which was to have an inflation targeting regime with a floating exchange rate. And we knew that was going to be more difficult in order to coordinate expectations, because you don't have that thing which is very visible, which is exchange rate stability, but that we were going to be building a macroeconomy which was going to be much more resilient in the medium term. So again, I think it was a trade-off between short-term gains and long-term cost versus short-term cost in order to build a more resilient macro. And we decided we were going to go the second way, because I think it happens in monetary policy, but I think it happens in all the spheres of governments, that the idea is to build a better economy with a view on the long run and sustainable growth, and really kind of getting Argentina out of this path of instability that has been basically imposed by the fact that you have always had a very short-term view on things. Now, so the results, of course, you can always say I can see the glass half full or I can see the glass half empty. Okay, so let me see how you could see the glass half full, and then we can see the half empty. Of course, we have been bringing down inflation. This year, inflation is going to be substantially lower than the inflation rate that we had in last year. Inflation is basically at the lowest level in about 7 years, particularly if you look at core inflation. My preferred measure of inflation right now is the three-month moving average of core inflation. I take a 3-month moving average because if you take one specific month, sometimes that has a bit of noise. And that number is basically at a significantly low level. I think now when the October numbers will come, we're going to have that number well below 20%. And this is a number for core inflation that Argentina has not seen in quite a while. So it has when you look at core inflation, you see a sustainable downward path. And this, what I think is interesting, is that this reduction in inflation rate happened at a time where the economy recovered very strongly. And this is a point that we were emphasizing last year, which is to having a tougher monetary policy to bring down inflation was not going to generate necessarily an output cost, because the supplied shock, the positive supplied effects of bringing down inflation were going to compensate for sure, and you're going to have a growth of the economy. So we have, this system has allowed to start a process of reducing inflation while the economy has been growing, and in a process where I would say, continuing with the glass half full, where expectations, well, it may be true that expectations are still not on our target for next year and the following year, but expectations certainly suggest that there's going to be a sharp disinflation next year and an additional sharp disinflation in the following year. So the market is expecting a sustainable disinflation path, at the same time that they're expecting the economy to continue to grow next year and the following year. So that would basically imply 3 years where the economy will be disinflating and will be growing, and I think that is a good that's a good record for the system if we finally are able to achieve, and even though we may be more ambitious, for example on the inflation front we may be more ambitious, but even those results which are to their expectations would be, I think, very successful. Now the glass half empty would be the fact that our disinflation process has not come apace in the way that we were expecting, and we are not going to achieve the target this year. We have, well, as you were saying, hypotheses, no? The hypothesis that you have for this, we've been very clear. We think in the last 2 months, in the first 2 months of this year, we had a process of monetary easing, which with the benefit of hindsight turned out to be too aggressive. People say, well, so you made a mistake. Well, yes, we made a mistake. I mean, you have to decodify what's happening in the economy. We had very low inflation in December of last year and January of this year. We had an exchange rate which was totally stable at the beginning of the year. So we were kind of receiving our high frequency price adjustments were also very low. So we're getting a number of readings towards the end of last year and the beginning of this year, which somehow convinced the Monetary Policy Committee that there was room, and then that turned out to be too optimistic. So that's the reason that since, I would say, starting in March, we have started a tightening cycle that has lasted, I would say, until, this week we did a second increase in our policy rate, the second in the row, 2 meetings with an increase in the policy rate. But it basically continues a process that has happened throughout the whole year, which a cycle of tightening, and at each moment in time we evaluate if it's enough or it's not enough, with the difficulties that you have, because monetary policy works with a lag, and it's very difficult to be in a big high, I think of the people in the US and Europe, so they have in a big freeway, because I say monetary policy is like a car that when you move the handle, el manubrio, the handle, the manubrio, okay, when you move the manubrio, the car moves 7 blocks down the road, because you have the lag. So if you're in a big freeway, and I imagine Draghi, okay, so he moves a little bit, 25 basis points, 15 basis points, and you have a lot of time to correct. But bringing inflation down from the Argentinian level, it's like you're kind of going downhill in a very, with a lot of curves coming down the mountains, and you have to say, okay, I'm going to move this, and then you have to move 7 blocks down the road, and so certainly it's it's very challenging, and that's the reason I think why at the beginning of this year we somehow eased too much without inadvertently, But going back, I think we have a very consolidated process of disinflation. We are seeing it in the core inflation, which is continues to come down. And again, we had the lowest core inflation in the 3rd quarter of this year. And again, I think the October numbers from what we're seeing from high frequencies will provide a further decline in core inflation, and that's extremely encouraging for us. And And then I think we're going to talk later about the role of floating exchange rates, which I think has also been tremendously instrumental for Argentina to have a really smooth recovery throughout the last year, and I think has been kind of the other side in which this monetary framework has been very, very helpful and very good for Argentina.
On these grounds, history matters, because people adapt and people learn to deal with inflation. And for example, in Uruguay, for about half a century, we had a 2- and 3-digit inflation almost permanently. So for the last decade or so, we have a 1-digit inflation, which in fact we consider that a success for the Uruguayan economy and for the Uruguayan society, because all Uruguayans learned that inflation is bad. And that wasn't that established before. We are using an inflation targeting regime for about a decade too, but we don't see the inflation targeting regime as a rigid model. We feel that we are all learning in the process with some key features. For example, we know that credibility is crucial for having an inflation targeting scheme, and also that transparency is crucial. But transparency is relevant when you have transparent variables in the variables that are crucial in the process. And I say that because I want to tell you that, for example, Uruguay had switched from money aggregates to interest rates to money aggregates again as the key signaling instrument in the monetary process and in the inflation targeting regime, because we all have learned that interest rates are, of course, a relevant signal, not just the monetary policy interest rate, not just the overnight interest rate, but the whole curve of interest rates is what you want to affect in order to have monetary impact. But you might be more successful in doing that by setting and giving the signal through money aggregates than through interest rates, depending on the specific features of every economy. Uruguay is a very small economy, but also we don't have too deep financial markets. We have a history of high inflation, so nominal interest rates are high, but the level of credit in the Uruguayan economy is very low, not as much as in Argentina, but low in historical terms and in any international comparison terms. So the strength of the monetary policy transmission mechanisms is very low, particularly if you set the interest rate. For example, 100 basis points movement in the interest rates in Uruguay affects almost nothing in the financial process and in the credit process, because nominal interest rate for consumption is 35. So probably in theory, setting the interest rate as the instrument of monetary policy could be more transparent, but in fact that transparency worth not much if interest rate is essentially worthless in the process of monetary policy. So we switch again towards in 2013 by using the money aggregates as the signal of the monetary policy, because we feel that in the inflation targeting scheme, what is crucial is how you influence or affect expectations, and you try to coordinate expectations. And of course, it's not done just by setting one variable, but also in having more transparency in the whole, in all the dimensions of the policy. You know, in your monetary policy reports, in how you deal with communicating your decisions, and also how you deal with communicating how you see the environment, what expectations you have. You have to be credible in all dimensions, and not just in setting one variable of the process. And we are very comfortable with our decisions in 2013 on moving towards the money aggregates as the tool, or the signaling tool, let's say. But because that we set an indicative target for money aggregate, it doesn't mean that we stop looking at interest rates. Interest rates continue to be very relevant, in particular the whole yield curve, because it's through that yield curve that you affect financial decisions, but not by setting an overnight interest rate, but again as monetary policy. But we also, again, have to implement monetary policy in a context of a lot of volatility and uncertainty, and in a context of exchange rate flexibility. Again, a blessing, for cushioning all global and regional shocks we permanently have. But it implies that according to the expectation of how the US dollar will evolve in the future, we have, as I was saying before, capital inflows and outflows and portfolio changes towards dollarization or de-dollarization portfolios of pension funds, banks, insurance companies, and so on. And what that implies is that when we have so much volatility in the expectation on how the US dollar will evolve, we also have a lot of volatility in money demand. So by setting money aggregates, you also have to deal with a very fluctuating demand for domestic currency, and then in the process of implementing monetary policy, we have to also be very flexible in having the indicative range of money aggregates just as an indicative one. Because you have to adapt when you have a significant shift in money demand, you have to adapt very quickly, because otherwise you will be having absurd impact on interest rates. And we had this process in the two directions in the last few years, because when everybody thought that the US dollar will be increasing significantly, when we have the reversion of the US monetary policy, when we have the political issues in Brazil that affects also our exchange rates, so a lot of institutional investors re-dollarize their portfolios. So the money demand decreases significantly, and then money supply evolved largely below the indicative range. But after the process in which now the US dollar is expected to be stable, because all Fed's decisions are mainly anticipated, very gradual, and President Trump said that he feels that the US dollar is too strong for their friends in the export side of the US economy and so on. Well, right now, all institutional investors are de-dollarizing their portfolios again, and now we have to adapt, but supplying more money than the indicative range. So if you see the figures in Uruguay, you have a lot of quarters in which money aggregates increases significantly below the indicative range, and now a few quarters in which money aggregates evolve significantly above the indicative range. So it's obviously still an inflation targeting scheme, an inflation targeting regime, and when you have all those variabilities, you have to be very precise in trying to explain the process. And not draw conclusions just by seeing how one variable evolves, but you have to understand the whole scenario and all the interaction of all those variables, and try to be clear and credible on that explanation, because credibility and the ability to affect inflation expectation is always the key of the regime. And one final point on this ground is that when you have exchange rate flexibility, and then you don't have fixed exchange rates as in the 60s, or crawling pegs in the 70s, or target zones in the 90s, so the government is not providing an exchange rate insurance, because our financial ability is absurdly low when you have external shocks. And that's all those regimes which work in the beginning, as Federico was saying, ending exploding because we don't have the financial back to support it. But right now, when you have a fluctuating exchange rate, you also have to develop other insurance mechanisms. If the private sector implements the insurance for exchange rates or interest rate by themselves, it's okay. But in general, the experience shows that the governments, and particularly the central banks, have to play a crucial role as market makers of those insurance schemes and derivatives and forwards and futures, which is also a complementary element for having a more smoother monetary policy in a context of fluctuating exchange rates.
Okay, thank you. We're talking about the regime, but maybe there is an underlying question: is the targets are now adequate? Maybe questions about narrowing the range, widening, lowering the target. I'd like to couple this question with the next one. In this context, what is you mentioned already, not the role of the exchange rate, if there is a possible change in the management of exchange rate, more towards intervention or less. Maybe here I'd like to start with Federico, who is more clear in this sort of transition in terms of targets.
Terrific. Well, the inflation targets basically tell you where you want to go, what is your objective. And I think that your credibility emanates from the actions that you take in order to achieve those targets. For example, if we look at the history of expectations, we started about May, I think, or June of last year, doing a survey of market survey of expectations of policy rates, inflation, growth, exchange rates, etc. And at the beginning, for example, the inflation expectations for 2018, so this is June of last year, was around 14%. And right now, in the last survey, the inflation expectations for 2018 is 16%. For 2019, in June of last year, it was 9%, and now it's 11%. So here again, you can basically say, well, the glass half full or half empty, because starting from an inflation process where the inflation rate was 40%, and we've generated a disinflation process, a significant disinflation process this year, that the expectations for next year and the following moved 2 points. Because remember, this is not like the Chileans, they have 2% inflation per year, okay? We were starting from 40% inflation per year. So that means that the inflation expectations are anchored or are unanchored? Of course, we're definitely concerned. We need that number to go down, not to go up. But when you look at it in perspective relative to where the numbers are, I think that, as I was saying before, the credibility of that disinflation process is very well anchored. One of the big successes of the targets for us have been wage negotiations. Wage negotiations this year looked much more at the central bank's target than at past inflation, and I think that was very instrumental, that was very helpful. I think that has to repeat itself in 2018, and I think that was a great, that was one perhaps of the biggest success of the inflation targeting, or one of the big mechanisms. If you hear in the question saying, well, what do you think about the target? Well, our targets are not very ambitious. Again, these guys here to my left, you have to just cross the Andes, okay? You don't have to go to Scandinavia, okay? You just have to cross the Andes, and they have 3% plus minus 2, okay? So plus minus 1, sorry. So. And why did our targets were not more aggressive? Well, they were not more aggressive because in the convergence program, you had a gradual convergence of the fiscal numbers, and that entailed from the beginning that there were going to be transfers from the central bank in a decreasing fashion, and the targets were set in a way which was consistent with the growth in money demand, which could accommodate those transfers. And that's why the targets, so these targets were well thought out, I mean, and they had a rationale, and they had to do with a combination of monetary and fiscal policy, which was thought out from the beginning. Going to the to the exchange rate, I think the floating exchange rate serves three purposes. One was already mentioned by Mario, which is to absorb external shocks. In the case of Uruguay, I can imagine with Brazil and Argentina on the side, very relevant. In the case of Argentina, extremely relevant as well. I think this is perhaps one of the things that has worked best over the last year in Argentina. We had three shocks. We had Brexit, we had Trump, and we had Temer. And you, for example, when you had the Temer shock and the real depreciated 5%, the peso moved 5%, and really local economic activity was very well protected and very well insulated from that external shock. And I think that is the reason why the economy has been growing at a 4% annualized rate for the last 3 quarters, with very steady and very strong, and I think it has to do with the floating exchange rate. The other thing that the floating exchange rate does is what I call internal balance, which is, for example, now we have a recovery which is investment-led. If you look at the components of aggregate demand, investment is the one which is growing very fast, with no comparison with previous recoveries of the last 10 or 15 years. And that's very it's very import biased. I mean, if you have a lot of investment that has a large component of capital goods investment, which are at record high in Argentina right now. So what the floating exchange rate allows you is to keep the external accounts more or less in check. If you have a big disequilibrium in the external accounts, then the exchange rate will immediately take notice of that and will accommodate in a way that will allow the economy to have a sustainable growth process without generating large disequilibrium in external accounts. So I think we call that the internal balance channel. And the third channel is de-dollarization, because the exchange rate goes up, comes down. So at some point people say, well, I thought that historically in Argentina the dollar was something that had one value or higher. Okay, so this thing that the dollar may actually come down is kind of a new thing. Since we opened up the exchange rate market, on half the days the exchange rate moved up, and on half the days it came down. So which is what theory tells you should happen, no? With an asset price which looks like that. So I think it will help a lot in the de-dollarization process. In terms of interventions in the exchange rate market, which you were asking here, we have said if we see something which is very disruptive, we may intervene. We've done that on, I think, 3 or 4 occasions since we opened up to have a freely floating. And then you have another intervention that we do is that we have decided that we were going to increase our stock of foreign reserves. And we set a target for us, and the way initially we bought reserves in the open market, for the last 6 months we've basically been buying the reserves, the foreign exchange that the Treasury is selling to us. That has implied an increase in reserves. As you know, for example, yesterday we reached a record high, historical, never achieved level of reserves in Argentina. I've mentioned in the last week that if you take this going forward, that 15% objective may be reached before we thought or we were planning to, and that basically will require us to evaluate or reevaluate the speed at which we will be accumulating reserves. So I think that's a little bit on the table right now because of the speed at which Argentina has been accumulating reserves. But having said that, I think that the floating exchange rate has served Argentina very well. I think we're already seeing the benefits in terms of its shock-absorbing power. And so I think that is really generating a much more resilient macroeconomy going forward.
I just wanted to
Sure.
add a particular point in your case, which is this monetary aggregates instrument.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you are, of course, the inflation target, a different instrument to the usual one. Is there any prospect of this being reevaluated again to more standard interest rates?
Well, in fact, we're very comfortable with by using monetary aggregates or money aggregates as the tool or the signaling tool of monetary process. In theory, you don't have any concluding studies that say that interest rate is the instrument for monetary policy. In fact, in theory, what is related to prices are essentially the quantity of money. But what is clear also in theory and in practice is that when you have you don't have deep financial markets, you don't have a deep banking system, and so money aggregates could be much more informative than interest rates. So we're very comfortable with that, and we are not seeing the need for revising that. We don't say that we all have to use money aggregates, not at all. We don't have that attitude at all. It works for us. So any country, any central bank should choose the variable that fits better with their situation and that works better. And we are much more comfortable with money aggregates than with interest rate. About the other issues, I have to tell you about two graphic images we used to have in communication in Uruguay in the last few years. So the media and the private analysts laugh a lot about that, but we found it very, very useful to graphically show how we think the environment and the objectives and the operationalization of monetary policy. The first one is related to the target range. That we emphasize the idea that the issue is not hitting the duck, because you might have inflation within the range just by chance, not necessarily because of your policy. But having the inflation rate outside the range, if you have a reasonable explanation, is not necessarily a bad thing. And you don't have to react by, for example, increasing the range, because the setting of the inflation rate itself is a signaling tool. So the objective shouldn't be to foresee the inflation and set the range in the inflation you think you will be, but to use the range as a tool to anchor expectations. And if you are above that range, it's not a bad thing if you have a converging process and a reasonable explanation of that. And then you use that as an anchor tool, and it wouldn't be misunderstood that you increase the range just for saying, oh, I have the inflation rate within the range. No, it's like moving el arco. Sorry, I had to talk about soccer. I know it's not the best time for it. But so the problem is not hitting the duck, but being credible. And being credible is just explaining why you have the range you have, even if inflation rate is above the range, but you show a converging path and you have a reasonable explanation for that. And if you are credible, you will help in affecting expectation by keeping the target range lower and instead of hitting the duck and moving the range. We are comfortable with our target range. It's a 5% with the slackness of 2%, but it depends on inflationary history too. If we had half a century with 40, 60, 80, 100% of inflation, having a 5% inflation in Uruguay is relatively low, and perhaps it's high in New Zealand. So history matters on that grounds. People is very used to deal with a 5, 6, 7% of inflation in Uruguay. It doesn't affect essentially economic or financial decisions. The other picture we use is that we have to have a balance of several goals and objectives in economic policy, and we have to deal with them simultaneously. And it's like having the Chinese plates rounding simultaneously. And when the central bank is setting monetary policy, the central bank has to have an eye on exchange rates, on fiscal accounts, on competitiveness, on financial stability. Regardless, it's explicitly in the charts, in the central bank charts. Even if the chart doesn't mention financial stability, central bank has to deal with financial stability anyway. So you have to have all the Chinese plates running at the same time. That implies that you don't have to evaluate inflation target schemes only by looking at inflation, but also by looking at how you deal with simultaneous goals, which includes competitiveness, financial stability, price stability, and the sustainability of fiscal accounts. Because if you are a fundamentalist, I don't know, if inflation is your religion, you probably would be solving the inflationary process for a while, but if you lose the perspective in competitiveness or fiscal sustainability or financial stability, you won't solve inflation either. So we are very, very clear about having all those objectives at the same time, which imply a lot of coordination with the ministry and so on, because we have to be solving the whole context of stability. It's absurd to have price stability in a context of financial or fiscal accounts instability. And the circumstances affect which of the Chinese plays you have to focus more at any time. For example, in Uruguay right now, we have to put more emphasis on competitiveness and the sustainability of public accounts rather than price or financial stability. But this constellation and this emphasis are different than, for example, 3 or 4 years ago, when we have more problems with price stability, for example. So again, hitting the duck or Chinese plates we feel there are two graphic images to help to understand how we use the target range in the inflation targeting regime, and also how we do the complementing policies in terms of interventions, for example, because I think that interventions are not inconsistent with an inflation targeting regime. But you have to be very clear about what criteria you use in order to intervene. And the criteria and I think we try to show from the economic team perspective is that we intervene because we need to have all our Chinese plates rounding at the same time. Sometimes we intervene in one direction because we are more worried about price and financial stability, and for a while we are intervening in the other direction because we are more concerned on fiscal accounts and competitiveness. But you have to be very explicit and clear in what criteria you use to intervene in exchange rate markets.
Then, Rodrigo, in your case, in the case of Chile, the regime is pretty consolidated and successful. Do you see any twist or any possibility, or do you think it's better to keep it with it?
I think it's worked well. By the way, I'm going to skip the issue of soccer, okay?
You have no chance.
I think it's worked okay in the case of, we're talking about inflation targets.
Yeah, of course.
It's worked quite appropriately in our case. There's all this issue on whether in some advanced economies on whether they should increase the inflation target from 2 to 3%, and the reason being that on the one hand you have very low inflation, on the other hand you have a lower bound for nominal interest rates, which we know now that it's not zero, but it's close to zero. So there is a sort of a bound also for real interest rates. I think 3% in our case has been okay. More important than that has been the time framework, because I mentioned you before, the inflation target in our case is 3%, and the average inflation rate has been 3.2%. Now, more than 40% of the time, inflation has been off the inflation range, either above 4% or below 2%. we're small, open economies, subject, to many shocks. It's sort of normal to be either above or below the target range. But it's very important that the population understand that. And basically, in our case, I think it's because of the history and because the inflation has been on average 3%, they do. Perhaps more important than that has been the time framework, but because most of the countries that have inflation targets say that they will achieve the inflation target in the medium term. We are more specific. We say in the next couple of years, so it's 2 years in our case. And it's basically what Mario was saying. It's not the inflation right now, but the expected inflation in 2 years has to be on target, which is okay. Now, what happens, and that has happened in our case, when inflation is, let's say, 1.5 years above target or below target? Of course, it doesn't matter, because what matters is expected inflation 2 years forward. But sometimes people do not understand that and say, well, look, you said 2 years and you've been 1.5 years or perhaps 2 years above or below target. So that's something which, that might be some improvement in the rule, to change from 2 years to something like the medium term. However, on the other hand, you might lose credibility if you are a bit loose on that issue. Of course, there is a trade-off. If the phasing is too slow, then you might lose credibility, or if it is too fast, you might have an effect on the real economy. In our case, this issue of how fast should be the phasing towards a lower inflation. We had that discussion back in the 1990s. We started with 20% inflation, and at the end of the decade it was 3%. But the basic issue in our case was the persistence of inflation, indexation, basically indexation. And there was this big fear that indexation could produce a lot of persistence in terms of inflation. So if you wanted to go too fast, you might end up with a sort of a recession or high unemployment. That was not the case. And perhaps we could have done that faster, but you never know. Regarding exchange rate, I think as it is the case, Federico was mentioning the importance of exchange rate flexibility as a shock absorber. That's worked, and we use that. In that sense, in our case, there's been no interventions in the exchange rate in Chile for the last 7 years now. The last intervention was back in the early. It's been 6 years, in 2011, and there was another one in 2008, and that was because we wanted to build up reserves, as Federico mentioned, was also the case here in Argentina at some point. If you believe in exchange rate flexibility, you have to avoid intervening. It has to be a very, very last resort, and we see that way. And that's the case why we haven't intervened in the last many years.
Okay, thank you. Let's move to the last question, which, as you know, is very keen on my institution. It's about the role of financial stability in monetary policy frameworks and also in central banks, meaning the interrelation between macro-pru, monetary policy, the possibility of going in different directions. And a specific more point is about what is called now capital account management measures, which was in the past called capital controls, and if this is worth it, or is too much of a distortion to apply. Mario mentioned before financial stability. If you want to add something more, we start with you.
Yes. Well, I'll try to be brief on that. I think that, in our case, for example, the central bank is not only responsible for monetary policy, but also for financial regulation. There are several different schemes in how to organize financial regulation or banking regulation, and if they are within or outside the central banks. But in any case, I think that financial stability is something that central banks should focus on, because it affects price stability. Even if you have a single mandate on price stability, you have to be, particularly in our countries in which you have two currencies, you have to be focused also on financial stability. But I think that we learn more and more that everything is more and more interrelated. You know, what's happening in financial markets and in the real sector and so on, and prices. And my answer to that is that what we call macroprudential measures, that in fact we begin intuitively setting measures when we have these huge capital flows and so on after the financial crisis in the US. You have to recall that there is a huge amount of liquidity in the world right now. So you have 4 or 5 times the US dollars in the world than 10 years ago, 2 or 3 times euro, 2 or 3 times or more yens. So there's a lot of liquidity and also an increasing amount of liquid instruments. I always remember Guillermo Calvo's assessment about the endogeneity of liquidity. So the problem is that what happened with those liquid instruments today are not liquid anymore in the future. No, that's a huge problem. But what I was trying to say is that when you have these distorting capital flows, particularly for small emerging markets, we intuitively begin to set some measures to smooth the process. A few years after that, we begin to call it macroprudential because we needed a name to rationalize what we did, in fact, I think. But I think that macroprudential and capital, the IMF was very unfortunate in calling those measures capital controls because we had that reminiscence of what was happening when capital flows were forbidden and in the 60s and so on. I like a lot the capital flows management measures. And we think that in this new context in which we are exposed to global shocks, regional shocks, with the volatility and uncertainty that we have in the world today, the macroprudential and capital account management measures have to be in the toolkit. It doesn't mean that you have to implement that permanently. You have to use it opportunistically, I would say. And to do that, again, credibility is crucial. You have to explain very well why you set measures that are not conventional, for example. But I think that we all have learned that those unconventional measures were essential in order to smooth the financial stability and in order to absorb the volatility in financial markets. So I think that, again, the Chinese plates. Now we have to be focusing on several goals at the same time, simultaneously. Financial stability is one of them for sure, and the need for having these unconventional measures in the toolkit is also relevant, and you should use it opportunistically, but explaining very well why and when and in what magnitude you are using at any time.
Yes, thanks. Of course, financial stability is a very important objective. In our case, the act of the central bank has basically 2 objectives. Well, the first one, price stability, and the second one, it's more restricted, is payments, the well-functioning of the internal and external payments. But it's seen as a mandate on financial stability. Actually, there's a chapter which is called Financial Stability in the Act of the Central Bank of Chile. Now, given that we do not have, as it is the case in Uruguay, financial supervision in the central bank, this is, of course, a matter for the central bank, but also for other institutions. All superintendencies, of financial superintendencies, securities, insurance, banks, pensions, and the central bank and the Ministry of Finance. We do have this Financial Stability Council, which meets once a month and basically sees all issues related to financial stability. But each institution separately has mandates of different matters. Now, I might have a different view on the instruments, because the basic question is not whether this is important and there has to be an institution in charge of this, but what are the instruments that you want to use? Do you want to use monetary policy instruments for financial stability, or you don't? And my view is that different instruments should be used for many reasons. One of them is that the business cycle and the credit cycles do not necessarily coincide. So you might have undesirable effects. For instance, if you raise rates because of financial stability concerns, but inflation is too low and the economy is too weak, you might end up, further weakening the economy. There are some examples on that. Sweden, back in the 2011 or 12, had that type of situation. I think in addition it makes monetary policy more complex and less transparent. You might lose credibility if you start looking at other objectives. So I think it is not that the central bank shouldn't care about financial stability, of course it should, but I think it should use different, in most cases, not in most cases, in many cases, let's say, different instruments. And macro-pru is the tool to use in these cases. Of course, it may be the case that both cycles, the financial and the monetary and the business cycle coincide, and you can use both, but each one has a different clear objective. Now, regarding capital account management measures or capital controls, I'm not really fond of them. We used them for the last time 20 years ago, back in the late 1990s. During all the 1990s, we used capital controls, and most of the evidence that we have on them is that they didn't work very well. They were not that effective. Perhaps they were effective at the beginning when they were implemented, not afterwards. The market finds a way to circumvent controls. They introduce distortions. So it is not that I rule them out completely, but I think that they have to be a very, very, very last resort, used as a very, very last resort. There are many costs associated to capital controls, and I don't see, in most situations, clear benefits.
Yeah, footnote, perhaps starting with that, we have no problem conceptually with capital controls. In fact, we've used them. For example, at the beginning, we made investments in our central bank paper, which are the LEVACs, not euro-clearable. So that was and we did this very early on, and this was a way of kind of keeping foreigners away from the instrument. Now, at some points, we were tempted in basically going more strongly and kind of putting some kind of restrictions, but we were not willing to go that way, because if we would have gone that way, like for example, not allowing foreigners to buy the instruments, that implies that you have to put like a cepo upside down. Because, for example, the previous government had an exchange rate control so that dollars would not leave. This would be kind of the similar thing for dollars not to come in. And we really weren't, we think that was going to be a very negative signal for the economy, and the cost would clearly outweigh whatever benefits you could have from that. So we were not willing, and we're not willing to go that way. Now, saying they're not euro-clearable, no problem with that, okay? And so I think also you have to be diverse and creative and be open to different options. Now, financial stability obviously is a very important issue. I have to say that in my tenure as president of the central bank has been one of the things that I've been less worried about. The reason being that the central bank, perhaps because of the history that Argentina has had with financial crisis, has created a very strong, very professional bureaucracy, which has very good supervision mechanisms. I would say that we're almost Basel III compliant at this point. We're very careful in terms of looking at the risk and mismatches that the financial sector have. Perhaps we are kind of overly cautious, but we're happy to keep it that way. And so certainly financial regulation I think is perhaps very much under control. We always say when we go into international forum that as Argentinians, we don't have many things to tell other countries what to do. We have a lot of things to tell them what not to do. But here it's a difference, because in terms of financial regulation, because of our experience, I think we are pretty well endowed, and we're very professional, and actually it has been very consistent throughout different governments. And I think Basel has given us the right umbrella to transform financial supervision into something which is totally professional and has a clear guidance, and in that case we really have to appreciate the work of the BIS in that respect. Let me just say a couple of things of what's happening with the financial sector in Argentina, and it's linked with monetary policy. We're actually having a boom in credit. For example, if you look at credit over the last 3 or 4 months, it's been growing at a 60% annualized rate. Of course, from very nominal, but still real, it's humongous, it's like 40. So the starting point is extremely low. I think the reason for this is, on the one hand, that we've done a lot of structural reform in the financial sector, and we have eased the way of doing business, we have reduced deadweight cost. But the other thing which is very important is the fact that we have a corridor of interest rate has stabilized the short-term rates. If you look at the graph of short-term rates in Argentina over the last 1.5 years, and you put it together with the graph which shows the previous 5 years, it's like a straight line. Now we look at our corridor and we see the movement, but it's a straight line compared to what we had. So here the cost of money for the banks would move from one day from 15 nominal to 40 the following day, and then down to 24. And that instability in the cost of money made banks very reluctant to lend long-term, and I would say the high inflation made public very reluctant to take long-term loans. So the fact that all these things have somehow decreased in their perceived volatility, I think, are a very important factor behind the substantial growth in credit. Now, in a link with monetary policy is that at the same time when we started, banks had very high liquidity levels, which was basically a result of the same thing. If you have that volatility, you have to be very short-term and highly liquid. So this credit boom so far has been fed by a reduction in the liquidity levels. So that means that we may jack up interest rates, but the banks, rather than increasing the rate they pay to depositors, they bring down their liquidity. Now, this liquidity is falling very fast right now, so that means that looking forward, looking to 2018, the impact of our movements in the interest rates are going to have, we believe, given that the levels of liquidity are going to be much lower, a much more direct effect on the rate that banks pay to depositors. And that will increase, I think, very significantly the power of monetary policy in the future as a result of this convergence. So let me stop there.
Okay, very insightful, really. We have time for a couple of questions. Las preguntas pueden ser en español y las respuestas en ese caso también pueden serlo. Allí tenemos una pregunta. Puedes hacerla y yo la pongo en el altavoz.
Okay. Bueno, la pregunta es para el doctor Sturzenegger. El esfuerzo de desinflación que se está haciendo para sostenerlo en el mediano y largo plazo, particularmente más allá del periodo del presente gobierno, necesita sin duda una reforma también institucional, ¿verdad?, que lo sostenga en el largo plazo. ¿Qué tanto avance hemos tenido en esa dirección?
¿Vos decís en política monetaria o en general?
En política monetaria.
La pregunta es sobre si se prevén cambios institucionales en términos de política monetaria que refuercen el proceso.
Sí, es una pregunta muy interesante. Cuando en el año 2015 estábamos pensando este programa, una de las cosas que se puso sobre la mesa era si era necesario que el gobierno enviara el proyecto de ley al Congreso dándole una mayor independencia al Banco Central. Como comentaste vos, Rodrigo, en el año 90 ustedes lo cambiaron en Chile, ¿no? Y ahí la verdad que tengo que reconocer que yo fui un poco el responsable de esta visión. Es la siguiente: la verdad que Argentina está cansada de cambiar el marco institucional y no cambiar las acciones. Entonces pensamos que al cambiar el marco institucional ya somos Europa, y después no cambiamos nada y después eso termina pésimo. Entonces el modelo que yo sugerí, yo un poco lo decía, es vamos a ser exitosos en el proceso de desinflación en tanto en cuanto vayamos reduciendo lo que el Banco Central le tiene que dar al Tesoro. Entonces vamos a definir estas transferencias decrecientes. ¿Qué le va a dar más credibilidad a ese proceso? Que nosotros no hagamos transferencias porque cambiamos la ley y las prohibimos, o sea, como que nos ponemos de alguna manera un corset muy fuerte, o que no hagamos las transferencias pudiendo hacerlas. Por ejemplo, hoy el Banco Central está transfiriendo al Tesoro muy por debajo de lo que podría estar transfiriendo. Entonces, eso me parece que es un elemento muy central de credibilidad y de compromiso, porque no nos ata más que nuestra propia vocación y objetivo de bajar la inflación. El modelo que teníamos un poquito en mente era el modelo de Inglaterra. Inglaterra en los años 80 también venía de un proceso de muchísimas décadas de altísima inflación, no los niveles de Argentina, pero de altísima inflación. Ellos logran en los años 80 bajar la inflación, logran demostrar que el Banco de Inglaterra puede generar una economía más estabilizada, y cuando viene Tony Blair, que lo reemplaza John Major, Tony Blair dice, bueno, hay que darle independencia al Bank of England, porque yo necesito que esta credibilidad que se ganó a través de las acciones que hizo el Banco de Inglaterra se consolide institucionalmente. Ese es un poquito el modelo, no sé si correcto o no, pero que estamos siguiendo, que es: vamos a demostrarle a la economía argentina, a la sociedad argentina, que se puede tener una inflación baja y que eso es bueno. Y eso de por sí va a generar básicamente la consolidación institucional de la independencia del Banco Central. Pero la verdad que nos pareció que había que empezar por lo que hay que empezar, que es hacer las cosas. No, bueno, creo que se entiende.
¿Alguna pregunta más?
¿Puedo agregar algo? Con respecto a, por ejemplo, lo que tiene que ver también con lo institucional del Banco Central, como es la publicación de las minutas de las reuniones del Comité de Política Monetaria o de las opiniones de los integrantes de ese comité. ¿El Banco Central va a evaluar hacerlo como lo hacen ya los países de la región, por ejemplo, en algunos casos?
Bueno, podemos preguntarle a los colegas cómo lo hacen. Yo creo que hay una gran diversidad. Nosotros en nuestro comité trabajamos con debates que son muy amplios. En general logramos posiciones de consensos. Esa es la manera que venimos trabajando este tiempo, y por consiguiente nos parece que esa visión de consenso es la que queremos transmitir. Lo cual no quiere decir que en un futuro no pueda pensar en organizarse y transmitir las cosas de manera diferente, pero hoy por hoy nos sentimos bien cómodos con este enfoque.
Bueno, creo que hemos llegado al final de la sesión. We are at the end of the session. I would like to thank you for a very interesting panel, and thank you for the audience for attending. Thank you very much.